Hello everyone. I'm Rafiqa Hanif El Ardhi. I would like to talk about comparative literature, which is about translation and comparative literature, and what is the relationship between these two. What is the relation between translation itself and the comparative literature itself, and what is so ever there is need to be a good translator or need in to be a translator in the comparative literature that will be presented by me, Rafiqa Hanif El Ardhi. So the first issues I would like to talk is the introduction. Introduction to comparative literature has always understood itself to be concerned primarily with the relation among the literature of different languages. So mostly comparative literature is about how someone compare the literature between one nation, one country to other nation or to other country, which is really significant that they have a different culture, different languages, different uh, things, and different many different things and similarities that can be achieved or that can be compared between these two. So that's why the different languages and translation is really needed in this kind of comparison. Next, so its founding principle is that literary traditions are different, just as languages are, and the act of comparison comes to bridge their differences, as the act of translation bridges the difference among languages. So that's why we will talk about how these things can bridge into between these two things. How the translations, translator, and the comparative literature will bridges the difference between these two. How we can compare a literature between American literature and British literature, or how we compare the Australian literature with Indonesian literature. What is really the difference between the languages, or maybe the culture, or maybe the significant things that we find out after we compare between these two? So, translation. What is really translation? Why translation is really needed in the comparative literature? Even though comparative literature is not about two countries, two literatures, it's about how we can compare a two country literature with the translation itself. With this translation, it's not just about meaning, but it's about message they want to search to the reader. So that's why I we think that translation is really needed to compare two different literatures work. Comparative literature is really significant to the culture between two countries. So that's why people really like to compare two literature works that are in a different countries. So translating between languages that have less history in common or that are farther apart in some other dimension of meaning, leaves more areas of indeterminacy to be filled in, possibly arbitrarily by the translator. So in here, we believe that the language have less history in common, right? Every language have their backstories, back histories, how the Australian speak in English, not in the Aboriginal language anymore, and how the American have a significant or slightly have some English with British but different accent. How that is happen is mostly have the backstory itself. So we believe that translating have the intermediacy to be filled in that can be compare how the two languages is different with each other. So that's why the indeterminacies make it hard to judge such a translation by its accuracy, but also leave the standard of eligibility open to individual wishes. Creativity unbounded by rules. Some situations leave translator little choice. So that's why there's some words that cannot be translated, right? Because this word is have its meaning, have its own meaning in the that own language itself. Maybe we talk about how the hyperbole personification that have its own things in that country or in that language, so it will be hard for a translator to translate it. So that's why translator have a little choice but to translate it into a meaning, a message, not into a meaning but a message. Like, I want to talk about pencil, but pencil is not to be found in in Indonesian language. So I have to describe it like pencil is a utensil for you to write down in the paper and it can be erased. So you can be described in that things rather than just tell pencil itself without understood what the message behind that pencil. So that's why the translator usually have a situation where they have a little bit choice for them. So um that's why we cannot just judge a translation by its accuracies, because the accuracies leave the standard and how the people wanted to be it. So that's why I believe that the translator have to be a very good in making a decision to the to them to decide whether this is will be a good message or whether there will be a good meaning into a reader, so they are not really confused by the message they want to. So, come about a literary translator need. So, what is really the translator need in a literary work? The first one is a good insight into the cultural background and development of the source language. So, this is the very basic things. We have to acknowledge the Australian literature and Indonesian literature. So if we want to translate these two culture into a message, whether this is in Indonesian or whether it is in Australian, we should acknowledge their culture backgrounds, and that's why how we want to give the message behind it. The second thing is about place on word, slang, and references to other work. So whether the work is a popular work, a popular culture or literature, so of course we need the mostly or the recent work or maybe the slang words that usually used in that country, whether it is in Indonesian or whether you want to talk about Australian literature or others literature. So that's why you really need to understand and have a references to other works. And the third one, to be a good translator or to be a that literary translator need is about rhythm and style are also even more important in literary text, because it's we want to translate a poem or we want to translate a poetry. Of course it need a rhythm and its own style. So that's why when we want to translate it, we need the same rhythm as the original work. If we want to translate Australian poetry into in Indonesian, we need to search the word that is the similar have the similar rhythm with the original poetry. So that's why rhythm and style are also important in this case. And the fourth one is a literary translator may encounter terms within a specific subject area. So we need the term that is points out about that thing. So when we translate something, we should clearly find the things that will describe the word that we want to translate is more message, it have its own message, it's creatively included into this language. So that's why a literary translator needs more knowledge about both culture that one they translate into another. So the things is about what we need as a literary translator, right? So what is really a good translator itself? The first one, we should have a thorough knowledge of the source and target languages. Like I said before, even the literary need a literary translator need it. Even a translator in general also need this. So this is the most basic and important that we knowledge the source and the target languages. That mean we are really good at it. We are really have acknowledged about both uh, languages. It's mean that you are fluent in Indonesian or you should fluent in English. You should fluent in source and target language. You have incredibly good knowledge about it. And the second one is be able to identify with the author of the book or poem, understand the author culture and country. So even the literary translator and a good translator should be able to acknowledge the author. You should know their background, their culture, and their country, because the literary work, whether it's novel, whether it is about biography and etc., we need to identify the authors, because the author's taste will be the same as the place they are in. So Indonesian author will face or will have the muse of Indonesian people, the culture of its own. So that's why we should acknowledge their culture and etc. of the author itself. And the third one, as the last one, is employ a good method for translating literary text. This is really basic and really needed to be a good translator. Whether you are the translator something else or maybe article in etc., but as literary translator, it is really needed. So in general, in literary translation, we translate message, not meaning. So it's mean that you translate the message that will be consumed by the readers and acknowledged by the readers, that the reader understand what you want to talk about. It's not just about meaning word by word. You talk about pencil and in Indonesian is pencil, but you should acknowledge that people in Indonesian know about what is pencil. So that's why both culture have the same things first, or you have acknowledged both culture first before you translate it. So we should translate the message so that people can understand and consume it. So comparative literature itself is implicitly committed to performing and also to asserting theoretically the function and value of translation. So why and what it means? So we believe that texts have become more exotic. Exotic mean in here it's always developing. It's always developed into better and better way. So there is slang, there is a favorite language and being used by a teenager in etc. You acknowledge the audience of this literary work, whether this literary work is the audience is for the kids or children literature, or maybe this literary work audience is the teenager. So you should acknowledge the word, whether the work need a slang rhythm and etc. So that's why in here we talk about text have become more exotic. That's mean it's always developed. And also, this translation should contribute to a better and more correct understanding of the source culture of a country. Just as I said before, if we want to translate two different kind of literary work in a different country, we should acknowledge culture of a country itself and the resource. It's just not because it's a better way in the native. If you want to talk about American, you should ask the American itself. If you want to talk about Australia, you should ask the Australian itself. So the native will be understand and will be better to give you acknowledge about their own culture. So the relation comparative literature and translation itself, without the intermediary of translation, comparative literature cannot be performed, even if a comparatist knows many languages and has a great deal of knowledge of different literature. So that's why this is really needed, guys. So both of it is really needed in literary work. So they are kind of have a red thread between these two because the relation is really significant and really important between these things. So that's why literary works with a different country have this needed the relation comparative literature and the translation itself, because we translate something because we compare both of the thing based on the culture, based on the languages, and etc. So that's why we need it. So that's all from me. Thank you so much for listening all of my work and my speaking. If I'm really too fast, you can slow it down.